Hello everyone and welcome to another FTMA Australia webinar. Today's one is Understanding the Australian Sawn Timber Market with IndustryEdge's Tim Woods. It's going to be another fantastic webinar, I believe, and as I've seen a lot of Tim's work already. So I'd like to thank all of our sponsors. As you can see on the screen, FTMA Australia has been able to provide fantastic resources, especially throughout the pandemic. And it's thanks to the amazing support of all these amazing sponsors. Just upcoming webinars. Next week we've got Is Your Timber Fit for Purpose? Always a very contentious issue within the frame and truss industry. Andy McNaught from EWP Engineered Wood Products is going to present that webinar for us. So that's at 2 o'clock Australian Daylight Savings Time next week. So we on Wednesday, and we'll send out all the link to our members on Monday. But if you haven't registered yet, you can go to our website and do it. Now, on the 4th to the 9th of December, as I've mentioned before, is our FTMA 6 weeks of Christmas. This morning, I had to visit Four Pillars Gin Distillery, which is just down the road from me, and pick up 5 bottles of gin, cocktail set. That's one prize. We've got lots of fantastic prizes, and this is a way that we can finish off the year with a bit of good spirits. Literally, and we can have our sponsors talk directly to the fabricators about their services, about their products, or just introduce their team. We really ask that all FTMA members do share with their fabricators, all the fabricators share with their staff, because there's some good prizes for people to win, but more importantly, there's some great information. The first webinar will have a fabricator on from every state and territory who will answer questions about what the market is. Because I get calls from members all the time, and the members always want to know, what are you hearing around the traps? Well, this way, members can join us on the webinar, and they can hear from the horse's mouth, as we have people like Arthur Potter in ACT, Aaron Hillman up in Queensland, Andrew Newen or Christine Flanagan down here in Victoria. So we're going to have fabricators talk about how they've handled COVID, what they're finding with the market, what's been the biggest challenges. And I think that'll be really interesting for everybody. So I'll send out more information, and everyone has to register for that because it's for fabricator members or for FTMA members only. Our past webinars you can always view from our website. We've just actually looked at the YouTube channels, and it's amazing to see how many times these are being viewed. The top 100 builders webinar, which Alistair Woodard presented, which is only available to FTMA members in a private link, that's had over 75 views besides the 50 odd people that joined us on that day. And the best part about that is you can always have these as resources. So it's really good to see that 45 members have since gone and looked at the sales one from Jason Howe. So really pleased about those. But today, we've got Tim Woods, who's understanding the Australian sawn timber market. And I just think that we need more information so we can plan as an industry. When I first came into this job, there wasn't even a list of how many fabricators there are nationally. We've now got 273 plants. A good example, I've been talking to the Victorian Skills Commissioner's office, and they wanted to know how many plants in Victoria. I can provide them a list of plants based on whether they're small, medium and large, and what electorate they're in. And we've got it all set up here so we know which every plant is in what state, federal electorate. This is the sort of information we need that helps us lobby for you. And Tim's going to show you how you can help. So I'll just stop sharing this, and Tim will come on and show. And as you can see, 9:30 yesterday, Monday, I had my haircut for the first time in 8 weeks. And Tim, if you bring your video on, we can, people can see
that. Having some of those problems again, Kirsten, never mind.
Okay, we'll work through that.
My video should be on.
There you are.
There
we are. I'll stop my video and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Kirsten, and thank you all very much. I'm just getting my screen ready to share. Someone let me know if you, or Kirsten perhaps let me know if you can't see that.
It's all perfect.
I love that. That's great. Thanks very much. And as you can tell, I've had my haircut recently as 2 years ago. I had my haircut, the one hair that's left on the back of my head. So what like as Kirsten said, we're going to talk about today understanding the Australian sawn timber market. And I think Kirsten's lead-in is, as ever, excellent and quite precise. This is not just a discussion about and a presentation about what the actuals are in the sawn timber market. It's about getting into the shape that the sector, the fabricator sector, needs to be in if it's going to understand its market collectively, and also provide you at a business level with market level information that can assist you to understand your share and your price point in the market compared to others, without just relying on anecdote, but rather relying on actual data that is probably not available to most everybody in the sector currently. So we're going to talk about some of those things today. And but first of all, I know that I don't get away without providing something of a discussion on a housing update. I do want to discuss a little bit the role of fabricators in the housing economy, because I suspect that in a sector that's populated largely by small to medium-sized businesses, there's an expectation among yourselves, at least, that you're not as significant as in fact you are. And I think I can give you some clues about why, about how you are more significant in the housing economy than you might imagine, and why in some respects that means that it's even more important that you have access to reliable sectoral data. I'm going to cover off a little bit about Australia's softwood log supply and Australia's sawn softwood supply, so the sectors that are upstream of you that feed into your sector, to show you what their data looks like and to give you some clues about how they go about collecting and collating that data. And I do want to talk about what the power of good data for fabricators might be. And I'm going to use some recent examples that we, in the background, assisted FTMA with in its recent survey, just to glean a little bit of data from some fabricators and give you some insights into what, even at the most basic level, a small amount of data was able to tell us. I really like the idea of these things being dynamic, so I actually really do like face-to-face presentations. These platforms are great for sharing and sharing quickly, but they do sometimes stop us interacting. There are tools available to you, you know, the Q&A function and the chat function, and even the intervention by unmuting yourself. I think if you care to use those, that's fine with me. And, you know, I know that Kirsten will moderate that. And if I miss a question along the way in those written platforms like chat and so on, Kirsten, just let me know. Just jump online, let me know, and we can talk our way through that. I like to engage rather than just to sit here talking. So this slide deck will be available, and you can look at this separately and in your own right. I think the thing we would say at IndustryEdge is that this is all that we do. We're in fibre, and that includes forestry, it includes wood products, it includes housing products, and it includes pulp and paper products, where our pedigree began. That's all that we do, and hopefully that means that we've got the sort of focus that can support your sector and your businesses. It's really difficult for me these days to go out anywhere without talking about the housing market, and that's because the housing market is fundamental. We hear this all the time, right? The housing market is completely fundamental to the forestry and wood products industry. But I like to think of it the other way. The forestry and wood products industry is fundamental to the Australian housing market, especially freestanding houses. And there's a couple of things I want to just cover at the outset. I mean, the first is Australian dwelling approvals, you know, by state. And we're going to come back and visit this a little bit more, perhaps in some of this discussion. But what we can see here is that the two main states, so this is year ended August 2020, you can see that the two main states make up, you know, the very significant majority. So Victoria, the largest contributor to Australia's housing approvals over the last 12 months, and in fact over the last 3 or 4 years. So Victoria is continuing to be really quite a large contributor to approvals, and joined with New South Wales, well, they account for almost 2/3 of all the dwelling approvals. There was really some interesting data, and if I look away here, it's because I'm looking at a cheat sheet. These are not all numbers that I remember. New South Wales year on year, so that means the year ended August 2019 to 2020, that 47,100 odd is 14% less than it was a year before. So New South Wales last year, housing approvals have been on the slide. Victoria's are actually 6% higher year ended August 2020. And that's pretty interesting, right? With the lockdown in Victoria having been really quite strong, you might have anticipated that approvals would have fallen off a cliff. And certainly early on, February, March, that was exactly what we were expecting. But in fact, the pipeline that leads up, the time frame it takes, if you like, from someone thinking about it, a new house, a new building approval, through to the point where they make the commitment is actually quite a bit longer time frame than we'd imagine. So what we understand now is that around July and August, the numbers that we're seeing in approvals, and I'll come to those monthly numbers shortly, but even in Victoria, those numbers are still pulling through commitments that were being thought about in January, February and March, all the way through August, etc. So if there is a slump to come from the pandemic, particularly in Victoria and the lockdown, it could still be a couple of months away. And it might be that because of, in general, the last several years of population expansion in Victoria, that there just isn't going to be a complete drop-off. There's certainly no evidence of that in Victoria at the moment, and certainly from what I hear among the builders, although I understand that you would be closer to them in a lot of cases, and you might have a different view about that for the remainder of the year. Queensland, year on year, down 6%, and then the smaller states all over the place. So South Australia, up 3%, Western Australia down 9%, Tasmania is stable, the Northern Territory is down 10% and the ACT is up 12%. So it's a really patchy landscape, right? Some states are up, some states are down, and either there is no pandemic effect on housing approvals, or the pandemic effect is yet to be felt. And it could be a mix of both. The bigger the state is, the more likelihood is that it takes longer for any effect to work its way through the market. So month on month, so if we think about August itself, August 2019 compared to August 2020, so New South Wales in August was down 20% on dwelling approvals year on year for August. Victoria was up 18%, Queensland up 8%, South Australia down 16% for WA, 15% and 22% down for Tasmania and Northern Territory. The ACT up 39%. Now, it could be that what we'd say is that as a general rule, we wouldn't compare a month in one year with a month in another year because it's too short a time frame overall. And I think that's pretty right, because those numbers are too big, month on month to be, and state by state to be making much of a distinction, except if we add them all up. So nationally, in August 2020, there were 13,900 dwelling approvals. In August 2019, there were 14,100 dwelling approvals in total in Australia. And so when we look across here on the right-hand side over here, we can see these last couple of years in houses and in townhouses, the 1- and 2-story townhouses. We can see those are relatively stable, but in fact, just beginning to curve upward again. And we can see that, as ever, flats and especially the 4-story apartments, pretty patchy, pretty up and down, quite seasonal at times of the year. And then, the big crashes when investors fell out of the market in the midst of the pandemic, a big lift up and some movement around, but nothing like the spikes we saw, 2 and 3 and 4 years ago in those approvals. So what we're, as a general and operating thesis, on a year-on-year basis, whether it's the annual number or it's the more immediate month-on-month number, you get pretty close, pretty similar numbers to the same time last year, notwithstanding the pandemic. And that makes sense in the housing market, because what we've been expecting to see was the beginnings of, albeit probably a small one, a second half of 2020, something of an upturn. We're maybe not seeing that because of the pandemic, but we're not, a million miles away from that at this point in time.
Hey, Tim, Christine Briggs has asked, what about financial year 21 new dwellings forecast, which we are now in? I read the other day that Vic is the only state now forecast to be down on 20 for detached housing, and it's forecast only to be 3%. Do you know, does that sound right?
Well, I think that's sort of consistent with the pipeline rolling through, Christina, and it makes sense to me that that a bigger state would take a little longer for the pipeline to work its way through. And I think realistically, the amount of time that people have not been able to spend looking at new housing options, not being able to go anywhere, it says that no matter what happens to population, and no matter what happens to employment, a really critical driver for for people's capacity to take out a loan and to be involved in a new dwelling. Those timeframe factors and other factors just have to weigh on Victoria. So I'm not surprised, to hear that there's that's part of the prognosis. The other states, I think it's, from what I've observed, I'm in Victoria, so I'm somewhat locked down, not entirely, but somewhat locked down. But from what I've observed, there's sufficient additional social freedom. There's more employment. We know that the employment train wreck that's coming later this year and early into next year is going to be worse in Victoria. So it makes sense to me that there'd be more difficulty in Victoria than elsewhere. There is one factor that I think is interesting to think about in the population sense. So Victoria's had high approvals because it's had an expanding population from both interstate migration, but also from overseas migration. But if it follows that we are not seeing new migrants come to Australia, and that's a source of long-term growth in our economy and long-term growth in the housing market, no question about that. It also follows that there are a whole lot of people who've come back to Australia, many of whom are not going to be leaving again for some years to come, and indeed many of whom might not leave again, time of life, etc. So the repatriation of parts of the population could itself be a short-term, not a long-term, it only happens once, a short-term replacement for some of the population of a net overseas migration losses. If people aren't going anywhere, then they will create some form of housing demand. I suspect that that's going to take a little while to wash its way through, and probably has a lot more to do with whether or not there are jobs that come up in the near future. So, a decline in Victoria of 3% kind of feels like it might be mild to me if that doesn't play out. But if it did play out well, so what would play out well is people who've come back to Australia, along with those who've lost their jobs, all getting jobs relatively quickly. You could see that be a relatively short-lived decline, but 3% decline doesn't sound very dramatic to me in the context of all the things that we've gone through. Doesn't surprise me, I guess. If there's one other thing I think I'd say about this housing situation here, look at the base load of demand. We can see the step down. This is houses on the blue lines here. You can see the step down that's occurred from one year to the next, but we can see that across the country, houses remain the base load, really not only just stable, but actually higher, just a little bit, but just a bit higher than they were in the same time last year. I think that's something for those of us who are heavily invested in the total housing market to really think about. Is the advantages that sector brings, especially when coupled with the red bar there, or the red lines there, that are the townhouses that use quite a lot of your products and a range of engineered wood products and so on. Important part of the housing economy, and an increasingly stable part of it as well, I notice in most jurisdictions. So that's a piece around the housing market. There's also a piece around data, right? I gave a couple of examples about year-on-year numbers. So total year versus total year, and single month versus single month. And this data in the chart here is in a sense more reliable than this snapshot of data. This gives you a bigger picture. And the reason it does that is because there's more periods over which data is being collected. It's one of the reasons why we like the idea of long-running data series, and it's something that I want to talk about as we go through this discussion. I just have to see if I can remove the Q&A box here. It was in my way. Forgive me. This chart here, or this graphic here, is what I consider to be a simplified version of a supply chain. These things are contestable. So that is to say, you know, someone might have a view and you might have a different view about that, and you know, you might have seen different versions of this, you know, from different parties, etc. So this is relatively simplified in the sense that what it doesn't do is deal with every last part of the supply chain, and it also doesn't break down, you know, business by business by business. Although, you know, that type of data exists, and you know, people like us hold on to that type of data. But what I'm at pains to do in describing this supply chain that starts with domestic growing of trees, harvest and haulage activity, primary milling activities like pulp mills, sawmills especially, and wood chip mills, and then rolling on to end product demand. What I'm at pains to do in this situation is pretty clearly and fairly obviously is to accentuate the role of frame and truss manufacturers. And why do I want to do that? Because the answer is really straightforward. I think that this sector considers that it's probably not the one of the 2 or 3 largest sectors in the Australian wood products economy. But on the face of it, while this is a broad estimate, on the face it won't be out by very much if it is out in any one year. On the face of it, the frame and truss manufacturers and the fabricators and installers are among the most significant contributors in the forest and wood products industry, but probably don't think of themselves in that way, and certainly don't collect their data in that sort of way. You can see the sawmills, and our estimation is, broadly speaking, are producing around 4 million cubic metres of sawn wood per year, and you're using more than half of that. And you're larger than the merchant and retailer sector that supplies you some of the wood, recognising that you get a large amount direct from sawmills, and certainly larger than the growing and really quite large timber packaging sector at 1 million cubic metres. So these things can, even like this simplified supply chain can get a little bit busy. So we might want to have a look at this from this sort of perspective. We'll just break it down and reduce some of the noise. Because what I want to impress upon you is that from any perspective, fabricators are actually pivotal to the Australian built environment. If it follows that you are heavily invested into freestanding housing, then it also follows that the freestanding housing sector is heavily invested in the future of the Australian forest and wood products industry and your role in it, the frame and truss manufacturers. And between yourselves and the sawmills, the direct line to the builders is so close. It's no wonder we spend a lot of time talking about the housing market. But we perhaps spend a lot more time talking about what the builders are doing and what the sawmills are doing and how they're supplying us and how we're supplying them, or what their demand is. And maybe not enough time in this sector. Others perhaps spend too much time gazing at their navel. I'm not sure that the fabricator sector spends enough time thinking about itself as a whole and as a sector. And I think some of that has to do with data. So I guess the question that we posed internally, and we've been doing a little work with FTMA on this and trying to do some thinking work around this, is, you know, we know quite a bit about others, but what do we know about you when it's compared with other sectors? And I want to cover off some of that in this discussion. And I imagine that there's people who are, you know, looking at all this and thinking to themselves, well, I can think of a box to put in here and a box to put in there. And I guess I can too, but if you bear with the underlying thought about your pivotal role, then you will understand my point in simplifying this somewhat. So one of the things we can tell you is we can tell you what logs are used, and we can tell you how much sawn wood is produced in Australia. And I just want to cover off on a couple of these things. This data, it might be a little hard to see that depending on the screen size you're looking at, but this is a long-running series, started in 1995, so it's a casual 25 years old. This data series has 50 6-monthly data points This is the Australian softwood log harvest from the first half of 1995 to the second half of 2019. And over that period, it's by different log types, so small, intermediate, medium, large saw logs, preservation logs, so for poles and those sorts of things, pulp logs that go into pulp mills, and then salvage logs where those are necessary and appropriate. It's a thing called the Australian Pine Log Price Index, and it has volumes. This is just showing you volumes, but it has prices as well. And the reason that I think it's worth looking at that is because when we think about that supply chain we were looking at before, the growers know how much they've grown, and they know what their average prices are, and they know that individually in their businesses, and then through a blind entry system, a survey if you like, they put the information in. Nobody else can see it, it's de-identified, and they aggregate the volumes of what has been produced and at what price it's been produced and sold into the market on a 6-monthly basis, and they make a report available quite broadly. This is publicly available information that we've got access to. And I can tell you that, for example, in 2019, so putting together those last 2 halves of the year, the Australian softwood log harvest was clearly below its peaks back there in around about 2008, but was at 6.7 million cubic metres, a little bit more than 6.7 million cubic metres for calendar year 2019. And you can see that there's some interesting developments there with a lot less small size logs being reported anyway as being harvested and etc. But what's the takeout point here? The growers know collectively, without knowing one another's numbers, they know collectively how much sawn softwood they harvested and put on the market by type. And yes, they know it by average price, not just by volume. What does that do for their businesses? That allows them to compare and contrast their own business, both as to market share, but also as to the prices that they might be achieving for the different predetermined log classes. And what about on the Australian sawn softwood sales? So this is Australian sawmills reporting to the into the Forest and Wood Products Australia softwood data series, again on a blind entry basis. That means they put their data in, all of them individually, and it gets aggregated into a whole. And while there's average pricing, the pricing is made available through a separate system called the Timber Market Survey currently. But what this data shows us is by grade or by type. I'll come to that question in a moment, James. What this shows is by type of timber product, what the national total sawn softwood sales were. And what I can tell you is the last month in this series currently is July 2020. The sawn softwood sales, so this is domestic sales, not imports, domestic sales from domestic sawmills were 306,000 cubic metres in July. That's a record. July 2020 was record reported sales of sawn softwood, higher than the previous high by about 3,200 cubic metres of wood. Now, James has asked a question about the sawn softwood graph here has 2 treated graphs. Says Kirsten that you're going to answer that question live. You are going to.
Okay. You're answering.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yes, it does. So you can see that one is the sawn wood is graded by dimension. So this treated structural is greater than 120 millimetres, and this treated structural is less than 120 millimetres. So the smaller size and the larger size. And I appreciate that. By the by, I appreciate that in here it's a little hard to see the details, but in some of the online platforms, including our own, where this is represented, hovering over this would allow you to be able to see which grades have done what. But note that over the course of this year, the step up in domestic sales has been, well, I mean, it's almost a continuous, it probably is a continuous listing up. Christine's making the point that treated here is H2F and H2, not H3 in this category. So that's a really good point. These are the defined categories for the purposes of recording sales across the country, and obviously there has to be some. Otherwise you end up with 100 different grades. You have to have some aggregations that occur over time, and some of them are historically based as well. My personal favourite is ungraded. I mean, after all this, what else is there that's left over? If only I could navigate that properly. Then there's ungraded. Well, why is this an important data set? Because alongside growers who know how much wood they have harvested and what prices they've sold it at and what market share they've got, the softwood sawmillers know how much in total they've done in the market, and they know how much their sales are month on month, and they can see that obviously here year on year, and they can collate it in a range of ways, and they can see their market share, and they can see average prices, and they know what their average price is that they've achieved in the market and sold into the market. And that makes sense because that's 4 million cubic metres a year, give or take, of production. It's really very significant. And they need to understand that to understand their businesses and know what to do best. So we can tell you average prices, not just volumes, and they know their average prices and their volumes, and they know that those of their average competitor as well, without anyone even having looked through to anyone else's data. Otherwise, none of them would participate, whether the growers or the sawmillers. We can also tell you what imports are coming to Australia and from where. So I can tell you that in the month of July, Australian sawn softwood imports into Australia totaled 47,000 cubic metres, 47,000 in August and just on 50,000 cubic metres in July. You can see that is, over that period, is around about, but in fact just a little bit below the average because of this dip. And you can see that just as sawn softwood sales have been going up, domestic sales, you can see that imports have been going up too, but not to the level that they went to before. So they're about half what they were, when they peaked in September 2018. And so what we would observe is that there's about 305,000 cubic metres of domestic sales, and there's about 47,000 cubic metres of imports. Then 1/7, 15% of the total sawn softwood being consumed in Australia month on month is coming from imports. So we know that, and we know that at a level of granularity that includes down to an average price, and it also includes by country here. Now, I've deliberately allowed this. There's actually 2 screens of countries, and many of them you can't even see the line in that, say, 47,000 cubic metres in August. But by drilling into that in detail, you can drill into what's structural and what's not. You can break that down in a really refined way. So we know what sawn wood came into Australia. We know what sawn wood was produced in Australia, and we can match that up grade by grade, even state by state in most cases, to work out what's being consumed across all those time periods for each country. And of course, we can do that by price. And that rounds out a kind of big picture that couples together growing and sawmilling. And it takes us through to your situation. So that little snip I took of that earlier chart is an estimate of what timber volumes you use. And I say we'll get pretty close on that. And one reason that I say that is because we've got a pretty clear idea from the growers and the sawmillers and the imports what is in the market. But what I can't do at the moment is do any better than say what the estimate of the timber use of the frame and truss manufacturers in Australia is. Can't get any closer to that, even though we get pretty close. Other sectors are able to pay close attention to their volumes and their prices, and they need to ensure the prices they pay and receive are competitive, and so do you. But at the moment, as the largest single users of sawn wood in Australia, even though you're no different, it's extremely hard to benchmark your business against the averages. Some of you will do that better in some regions than others and be more capable of doing that than others. And it's also difficult for you to see what that total picture is. Exactly how much timber are you using compared to others? How much, what prices are you paying compared with others? You know what you pay, but you don't know what the average of your competitors is paying. And when I say the average, I don't mean what the chap down the road is paying, business down the road is paying. What I mean is getting an understanding from a volume of producers, fabricators, who contribute their data without seeing one another's data, knowing their own and being able to say, well, actually, we're getting 5%, we're paying 5% less for our timber than somebody else is, or we're paying 5% more, or even we're actually using 10% more because we've got 10% more jobs than somebody else happens to have. And that might be distinct market to market, state by state, but it's data that at the moment you're relying on anecdote and discussion and not the reliability factors of consistently gathered data that are being relied upon by other sectors upstream of you in the supply chain. One thing we can't tell you at the moment is what you pay for your timber. We know that you know what you pay for it on a delivered basis, but we don't know what you are paying for it either individually or perhaps more importantly collectively on average across the supply chain. We can make pretty informed guesses based on the other end, what the sawmill prices are and what their delivered pricing is, but that doesn't always equate to exactly what you're paying. And the other piece that we haven't really talked about in here is we don't really know what you're getting paid for your product. So most of what we've looked at with the growers and with the sawmillers are producer output prices. What are they getting? What are their sales prices for their product? And we simply don't have that in most cases for fabricators. And there are a range of reasons for that, but one of the major ones is because there hasn't been a huge amount of effort put into aggregating that data. I know that standardising the information can be challenging, but there isn't a lot of effort going into that. Are you leaving value on the table in your discussions with builders compared to your competitors? I don't know. And I'm not sure that everybody in the sector knows. Some of you will know, of course, but others of you may not. And that's an opportunity that maybe is going missing for you. So we recently, I love this image. That's ganging up like no one's business, isn't it? Good luck to the Cobra. Recently, in discussion with FTMA, we came to understand that there was a member survey about to be conducted, and Kirsten was able to agree that there were some questions that we could place into that member survey to inform this webinar, just to see what sort of information we could gather. So the feedback from that survey saw 31 FTMA members answer just 3 questions as part of the member survey. The first question was, in August 2020, how much sawn softwood did you use in cubic metres? 19 of 31 participants answered. 12 said things like lots, I think more than last month. One wrote lots and lots and lots, and several left it blank. And it raises a question in my mind as whether out of 31 participants with 19 answers, whether 12 actually did not know how much they'd used. Granted, a couple will have decided just not to say, just for fear that the data might get out. And I'll show you here that the data doesn't have to get out for it to be a meaningful contributor to aggregate data. And what makes me think that, though, that a dozen, or at least some of that dozen who didn't answer, don't know how much sawn softwood they used, is that every one of the respondents answered the second and third questions. Did they use more or less than in the previous month, July 2020? And did they use more or less than in August of 2019? Everyone responded to that. And even that gives us some great clues that shows us the value of collecting some data. And I'm going to guess, but I reckon the average time it took those 3 questions to be answered was 1 minute in the general survey. So not very much time at all, but there's some good value we were able to extract from that. So of the, it's a small survey, it's not going to be statistically reliable, and it's only a snapshot in time. And we talked before about the risks of the snapshot in time, thinking about things in the snapshot in time. But of the 19 respondents, 425, the average was 425 cubic metres of sawn timber was used by each of those businesses. That's split up between large, medium and small enterprises, and that's defined. I didn't see the names of the businesses. And then again, I didn't see the names of those businesses. All I saw was FTMA saying that was a large, that's a medium, that's a small, and then we've taken the average. You can see that the skew 425 is above the medium and the small, and toward the larger group, toward the larger group of fabricators. As I say, not statistically reliable, but pretty useful. And as Christine's just commented, that she bets that the fabricators knew what their own production was, not necessarily the cubic metres of sawn wood input. And I think that's a really good point also about outputs. So I talked before about output pricing and output models. So how much more work did you do for a builder in the last month than you did in the prior month and in the same month in the previous year? Those are really good places where you earn your revenue. Is a good place for you to focus attention on gathering data. That's what the sawmillers do, and it's what the growers are doing. And so, there's a kind of supply chain of information that you can contribute to. So I found myself working through this, asking, we really do need to have a sense of how much raw material we use. And do we think that something pretty reliable as to numbers, like could 75% of fabricators answer the question, how much timber did you use last month in cubic metres? Could 75% of them answer that each month to create a reliable long-term data series that would show just how pivotal and significant you are in the industry? I suspect the answer to that's yes or close to yes. Even this provides a first clue to the health of the sector. An anonymous attendee asked, well, maybe some businesses didn't answer because they were worried you couldn't guarantee the aggregated data wouldn't identify their business. Completely agreed. I think that's absolutely likely to be the case, and I think I can make clear only as often as the opportunity allows that you don't need to see who the business is. It's not to do this type of work, particularly to pull up these sort of averages, etc. But one of the key pieces in collecting data is being reliable in the utilisation of that data and in protecting the integrity of it. And, the best models for this type of data collection just involve having an open portal where you've got you have to log in yourself. You put your own data in, and the moment you put it in, it disappears, and then you can't see it, and nor can anyone else. And certainly the systems that are used for the Pine Log Price Index, and especially the Sawn Softwood Data Series, you just can't see. Even who the businesses are. No one knows, and the numbers. Each business is just identified by a number, and that's the same way that the FTMA gave me this small snippet of data to provide some analysis for you. And I'm asked a further question on imports. Can I comment on Timber Supply Report that there is or will be no shortages to the market? What we're seeing now is a solid decrease in imported volumes for Q4 and likely Q1 21, combined with pressure on Australian suppliers for various reasons. Today we're already seeing pressures or lead times on key lines. Happy to wait till after the session for reply. Well, I think there's a difference between, I'm happy to provide a short answer. There's a difference between supply disruptions and actual shortages. There isn't evidence that on the housing approvals that we've got currently, that we've got an incapacity to supply, and I still observe imports at 15% of total supply and local sales at record monthly levels. Now, those things can flex and change. Absolutely agree that that's the case. But at around 15 and under 20%, when they tend to be capped out, and there seems to be quite a bit more pressure on the supply lines, the disruptions are one thing, but it doesn't look to me like there's a shortage coming. Now, what could affect that? What could change that? An inability to pay an international price in a slightly heated, I say slightly heated currently, lumber market, global lumber market, would have some impact. So it's a little surprising that the US market, housing market, and therefore lumber market is so strong. And you see that in the way the prices spiked dramatically. That price will probably come off in the next few months, and that might redirect some supply and soften the impacts of the North American market dragging lumber away from other markets like these. But if their housing market was to be sustained at very high levels, and those lumber prices were to remain, then you'd have to pay for the imported product. You have to pay the price that would be commanded in the global market to get access to that wood. But at the same time, we would then also have to have our own bit of a spike, I think, in housing approvals, because as it stands at the minute, our housing approvals and the building work that's in the pipeline and joining the pipeline is actually at a pretty stable level. So it's not that shortages can't arise, it's that there's no reason for them to arise currently. And I think the other piece in the disruptions at the moment, you might have heard, as an example, the Port of Sydney is all jammed up in some funny ways, really quite peculiar ways. And there's this kind of global market asymmetry that's at play currently. One market is up and busy at the moment, and the next market is, somewhere else is down and soft, or they're shut down for 2 weeks because of the pandemic and they can't ship. And so there's, instead of the global supply lines being, just circulating in a pretty consistent manner, they're disrupted in their own right. You can't discount those disruptions as being a factor in the current, in the sort of current global trade dynamics, including for imports of sawn wood. We've got a client currently who's waiting on material in Sydney. It's paper, but it's not radically different other than that it's containerised. They're waiting for product in their Sydney printing business, large printing business, which is not going to be landed in Sydney, is now on its way to Melbourne, and they're going to be waiting an extra 4 weeks for their supply because of that. So there's a variety of disruptions, and they're not all related to just straight supply. Sorry for taking a bit long with respect to that question. So average timber use was reportedly 425 cubic metres in August 2020. But there's a couple other things we were able to find out here. This shows here August 20 compared to July 20. So these were yes/no questions, right? Simple to answer, binaries. And these two questions told us that August 2020 was better than July 2020. So 64.5% of the 31 fabricators, you can work the number out for yourself, what the actual numbers were, used more timber than in July, but only 45% used more than a year ago. But it is 45% using more. That means 55% used the same or less than a year ago. So the market was a little stronger in August than it was in July, and that kind of holds true with that sawn softwood sales data that you saw, where the softwood sales in July were up, and that's feeding into August work and possibly September work for many fabricators. But, softer than it was a year ago, and perhaps no surprise in respect to that. So these are 3 questions that were asked in total that give us some clues, just as a test, that provide a few clues about the sector. They don't go anywhere near, from the point of view that we've been talking about, they don't go anywhere near providing enough detailed information, but they give us some insights. So the next piece is we looked at them from small, medium and large. And I don't know if anyone's surprised by this, but smaller fabricators appear on that data to be struggling more than larger. Just a snapshot, but an interesting story. So smaller fabricators, smaller fabricators, 50% did more work than in July 2020, or used more timber than in July 2020. But larger, 72.7% used more. And look at the symmetry between the two sets of numbers. More than August 2019, well, yes, but again, pretty soft across the board. But the larger producers, 54.5% of them were used more timber than they did a year previously. But everybody, but only just for the smaller players, using more than they used just 1 month, one month before. Now, this is useful information that begins to tell a story. And I guess that, picking up a point that Kirsten made, data like this could help the FTMA with lobbying and developing business support programs. And I'd argue even just seeing this is cause for some reflection by most businesses, perhaps not all, let alone thinking through a handful of structured questions every month, some of which have data attached to them and some of which, like this, are perception driven to some extent and can be perception driven, that they would actually be of assistance to businesses in understanding where they're at in their own market and where they're at in the context of their supply chain. I posed the question, could your business answer just a few questions every month or even every quarter when it comes to those things about timber volumes and perhaps prices, especially output prices that you're getting from builders, in exchange for understanding the state of the industry and how that compares over time and how that compares with your business. And I think realistically you could contribute 5 to 10 minutes every quarter with some of that data, so long as that data reliability was in place. And I think that's an opportunity for this really substantial sector to take up. So how do you go about this? Assuming you choose to leap from the small bowl into the big bowl, somewhat unknown but still full of water. A quarterly survey and data report. I think the FTMA conducts pretty regular surveys, and as I said, there's got to be controls around that to ensure that everybody is comfortable that their data is maintained as confidential. I suspect at most 15 to 20 minutes of your time, 4 times per year. No company identified, all details confidential. And I guess from my point of view, I don't even, I think about it as one of the people who analyses data in an industry. I don't even really particularly care what the name of the business is attached to it. I just need to know that it's different to the one on the line below it, so that each of them is a discrete piece of data. That can help to provide, get the questions right, that can help to provide fabricators with data to understand their market better. It can provide comparison tools for businesses. How's our business doing compared with our competitors? And of course, in a sectoral sense, how's our sector doing compared with our competitors? Why are we relying on the builders, for example, to tell us how much steel they're using instead of understanding how much of the market we've got for ourselves? Because what's clear is that you are still framing the significant majority of Australia's houses, but we rely on the builders for the data at one end if we're fabricators, and the sawmills and the growers at the other end for other bits of data. Where's your data set that takes you up to the level that probably rightly fits your role in the housing economy? That would be a powerful lobbying and information tool for your association, as I've discussed. So these are some snippets along the way about how we're thinking about data and how we're thinking about opportunities for you to access and utilise data in a de-identified way that can be meaningful for your business and for your sector. I have a direct interest in that. We collate and publish data, almost all of which is de-identified from the moment that we ever even get to see it. As I say, you can make a huge amount of difference in your business and in your sector with with a relatively small data contribution from a large enough group. And 250 frame and truss manufacturers providing data on a quarterly basis would be a meaningful and powerful data set in the Australian industry. And by that, I mean the Australian housing industry. And that's important because that's 20+% of the Australian economy that you actually contribute to. You can see how to contact me there. I'm very accessible. In the modern era these days, you don't worry about that number there, you just ring me direct. There's even every chance I'll take the call because I gather my information from the conversations I have with people like you. And in exchange for that, probably I'll give up some information along the way. So feel free to reach out at any time, and I look forward to engaging with you now on any questions or in any other way that you might choose now or in the future, Kirsten.
Thank you very much, Tim. I don't know about everyone else, but I find that really interesting that out of 3 questions, we can get so much information. I'd like to ask, we have 273 plants nationally. So how many fabricators would have to participate to make it worthwhile? And would it have to be, how many from each state, how many from each size? What would be, I suppose, a set that would be happy, like in regards to numbers?
There's 2 ways to go. One of which is deadly, which is everybody in, and you can't publish any data till everybody puts their data in each period, and that can only work after a period of time. The better way to go early on would be to establish a proper random sample that is got the right balances between large, medium and small, and the right balances between states. And maybe there's some other skew I haven't thought of, but you get the balances right and you create what's described as a survey panel. And you make certain it's statistically reliable, and then you switch off all the identifiable data, and you create a blind entry portal and they push the data in, and that way you get statistical reliability. You probably run something like that for a couple of years, and then you open it again and say worth revising, and you build the panel further, or you revise the panel entirely. That's the most statistically reliable. Very initially, you try and ask more open questions, and pretty basic questions at the first level, and that way everyone can contribute if they care to. But the more refined your questions get, the tighter you've got to be on that sample.
Yep.
We can devise that. It's just basic math. It's basic math multiplied by basic math, essentially, to create samples.
Okay. And Christine said their timber fabricators, knowing sawn wood used, could then convert to local carbon stored by this key customer segment. And of course, the nail plate software has actually got that in it, and available to all fabricators at the moment.
Yeah, and there are plenty of places, I think. One of the things that the modern world's taught us is that there's just data sitting everywhere, and the key thing is not that there's data everywhere, it's how do we get hold of the relevant bits, know what's relevant and know how to use it. I think you'll find that a lot of the data that you'd like to seek to get a national picture, ongoing picture of the sector and its role in the industry, it's all there. It's just a question of knowing what we're asking and then helping people find it the first few times. And then after that, the 15 or 20 minutes it takes, once a quarter to collate the data probably reduces from that.
And the right person. Whereas this survey went to a lot of principals, like the owners, whereas they're not necessarily the ones that you should be going to the purchasing officer, especially with the large and medium ones, to make sure it's the right person answering the questions.
Yeah, the person who collates the data or looks after that type of data or is just likely to know where it is the one who you really want to be talking to. And that takes business owners, though, to know that it's safe to do that, like on that question about, data, protection and integrity. So you've got to start with that at the right level. And I think being open about that, a sector like this could really demonstrate its weight within the housing market pretty quickly.
And so FTMA's engaged Tim to do 5 more reports this, or 4 more. So we've got one in November, and then we've got one in, I think, February, April and June, I think it is. So when doing those housing reports, how does this sort of information help you in doing those housing reports?
If we had even, how much, imagine this. This is a question I really want to ask. How many frames did you make for freestanding houses last month? So compare that with, over time, the building approvals, the housing approvals. Instead of guessing from the builder's numbers, we would know what your share versus steel and versus brick is. We could know that. Well, I think over a relatively short period of time, data like this would help us build reports that you could publicise instantly, as well as that kind of private market share data, as well as, Christine says, the carbon data, etc. You can, depending on what you collect, you can publicise all sorts of information. And of course, the fact you've collected it doesn't always mean that you have to share it. So some of it can be actually private to the industry. You have to be careful about that with pricing data. There are legal requirements about competition law that we have to meet. But when it comes to market share, it's not anyone else's business necessarily. That you've collected data that shows that your sector is actually 89% of frames in a particular state or whatever it happens to be. You don't have to share that.
And the data, I mean, the software from the 3 nailplate companies is just, I mean, it's quite amazing. And I know being at a Fabricators once, and they said, come on, ask me a question, because they wanted to show off on their particular software. And I said, well, how many 2-story houses have you done since August last year? And within 10 seconds, he goes, this is how many. And so I think that there's such amazing data because of the great work the 3 nailplate companies have been doing, that on the software for the Fabricators, that we can get this sort of information easily. But I think the key is for that, I suppose, to be aggregated and make sure that it protects them. Because when I explained this to one fabricator, they said, yeah, our industry's pretty switched on. It wouldn't take long for people to go, oh, that large fabricator, that must be so-and-so, and then everyone knows about our business, and they all get a bit nervous about that. I think that's the key.
Yeah, I mean, I think I get that, Kirsten. And look, I think if I was just to go back to this, I defy anyone to tell me what businesses were involved in that. I'm not saying that that's actually mathematically accurate at 425 cubed, but let's assume for a second it is. Well, except the businesses that contributed, no one knows who they are from that.
Yeah. And
I think what you're saying is quite right. The data is there, and it's in some really good places, developed by some, by some fabulously intelligent systems. You can suck that data out in a number of ways. And so long as nobody can see who's provided it, all that it can give you is advantages. I get it that you've got to meet that data integrity standard, but when you do, look at what you can deliver off almost no information.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Now, Tim, will I be able to share this presentation to the people that were joined us and registered today? Absolutely. I'll also send out the link once Nikita's done the recording and got it all ready. And of course, everyone, don't forget to register for next week's Is Your Timber Fit for Purpose? And I really thank you, Tim, because I think it's an exciting project, and I'm hoping that we can get enough fabricators on board to make it worthwhile, because I just think that our industry sometimes goes blind, and it doesn't help for a healthy industry if you don't have the data in front of you. And as everyone in Victoria knows, all you hear from Dan Andrews at the moment, it's all about the data. Data. So we all know, yeah, it's important. Indeed. So thank you very, very much, Tim. There are no other questions coming through. I have to go to Maroondah Hospital and pick up my son who's had a workplace accident, and surgery. So talk to everyone soon, and happy hump day. Bye.
Thank you. Good luck, Kirsten.
Thanks.